Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to technically week 10 of the semester. I think it's the fourth week of this remote coronavirus teaching. I hope all of you are doing well, or as well as possible under the circumstances. Hopefully you've settled into some sort of a routine. Hopefully things are not too hectic or crazy where you are. As always, if you're having trouble focusing or getting your work done for my classes, please just let me know. We'll work through something that is fair to everyone so that you can get the credit that you deserve for the class and for the work that you've put into it. Now, today we're going to begin a discussion, we're going to have a discussion on virtue ethics in the Anthropocene, thinking through kind of the implications of the conclusion of last week. So if last week we kind of concluded with the stunning failure of our existing global institutions to effectively respond to climate change, this week we're going to be talking a little bit about what we as individuals can do and the different modalities of that individual action. So our first is going to be talking about virtue ethics, looking at Dale Jamieson's work, and then we're going to talk about kind of conception of green citizenship on Wednesday. And Friday, we're going to be talking about fossil fuel divestment efforts as another kind of way to realize a form of just response to climate change, despite the inaction of existing institutions. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what virtue ethics means, as well as evaluating the strengths and limitations of virtue ethics in the context of climate change. And you're actually going to be doing a lot of that in your discussion threads for today's class. So let's jump right into it with a quick video on virtue ethics, introducing it. That is, of course, not working, even though it was working perfectly fine when I tested it before I started recording. So, and we're back. Okay, take 3. Here we go.
Virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a philosophy developed by Aristotle and other ancient Greeks. It is the quest to understand and live a life of moral character. This character-based approach to morality assumes that we acquire virtue through practice. By practicing being honest, brave, just, generous, and so on, a person develops an honorable and moral character. According to Aristotle, by honing virtuous habits, people will likely make the right choice when faced with ethical challenges. To illustrate the difference among 3 key moral philosophies, ethicists Mark White and Robert Arp to the film The Dark Knight, Batman has the opportunity to kill the Joker. Utilitarians, White and Arp suggest, would endorse killing the Joker. By taking this one life, Batman could save multitudes. Deontologists, on the other hand, would reject killing the Joker simply because it's wrong to kill. But a virtue ethicist would highlight the character of the person who kills the Joker. Does Batman want to be the kind of person who takes his enemies' lives? No. In fact, he doesn't. So, virtue ethics helps us understand what it means to be a virtuous human being. And it gives us a guide for living life without giving us specific rules for resolving ethical dilemmas.
So let's add a little bit more detail to that account. So if we, virtue ethics, we can basically define as a moral theory that grounds the decision-making in moral character rather than duties, as it is in Kantianism or deontology, the expected consequences or utility of an action, like utilitarianism, or based on a fair agreement, like Rawlsian contractarianism. So instead, the right thing to do is what is going to kind of reflect these virtues or or one's moral character. So this is a very different way of thinking about ethics than our traditional way. And people like Bernard Williams actually distinguish ethics from morality on this point, because it's not about a set of rules or laws that you use to that you defer your decision making to, but it's an account of a moral character. Ethics is rooted in the word ethos, which is like your character or your spirit or your disposition, and that you become better. You make good moral decisions not by following abstract rules, but you make good moral decisions by cultivating a moral character. And so what virtue ethics contends is that we need to cultivate virtues, which are character traits, habits, or dispositions that allow us to live meaningful, flourishing, and in Aristotle's language, excellent or great lives. These are the results of habits and practices, not mindsets. So it's not about having the right kind of intention or knowing. It's not a cognitive account here. And these are not absolute. You can be more or less virtuous. You can exhibit these virtues to varying degrees. And the other key idea in virtue ethics is the idea of practical wisdom or practical reason. In Greek, it's phronesis. And the idea here is that as we cultivate virtues, this allows us to develop the practical wisdom to be able to choose the most moral option in a particular context by weighing the particulars of the case. We've all kind of know from various thought experiments, things like the trolley problem, for example, that if we hold really strongly to certain moral rules, like maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, or never telling a lie for Kant, that we get into specific moral situations where following the moral rule seems to lead to the obviously worse outcome, like not lying to the Nazis at the door that you are hiding a Jewish family in your basement, right? That you would tell the truth in that situation, Kant would argue, and that seems obviously the wrong moral action. And so cultivating virtues allows us to be sensitive to morally relevant particulars and to understand when exceptions or qualifications are needed. So it actually allows us to kind of figure out what is morally important in this issue and what types of principles and what types of rules and what types of considerations should we take into account when making our decision and acting. So it's much more about cultivating a moral sensibility rather than kind of following a rule. So here, it's the practice is the important idea here, that it's not enough to know what the right thing to do is, but that only a virtuous person will actually do it. And in some cases, a virtue ethicist will say, like, yes, you should follow utilitarianism in this case, or you should follow Kantianism in this case. What's critical here is it's not really just about ethical theory. Virtue ethics is all about how do we actually develop the character so that when we are faced with a tough decision, or we're faced with a moral dilemma, or we're faced with a situation where we have to sacrifice something important to us for the moral thing to do, that we're actually able to follow through with it. And that's a question of character, not a question of theory. So Jamieson turns to virtue ethics because he believes that when we're talking about climate change, what he calls the global environmental challenge, or the challenge, that our kind of mainstream and dominant forms of moral thinking are going to lead us astray. And he focuses on a few in the introduction to this essay. The first is Kantianism, which is the idea that we should follow certain moral duties because they are the right things to do universally. You should never tell a lie because you have a duty to tell the truth in order to treat other people as dignified human beings. But Kantianism, for Jamieson, focuses too much on individuals and individual intentions, and it doesn't allow us to see kind of the collective nature of these problems. It's not just about the purity of one's intentions, it's about what happens when we have collective action. Similarly, contractarianism, which is a moral theory that is very similar to Rawls's, but the moral thing to do is derived from fair procedures. It'll give us a kind of a fair expectations of how we should behave towards each other. That what happens about non-parties and climate change, as we know, is all about how our actions affect people beyond our original intentions or the original acts themselves. He also contests what he calls common sense pluralism. Other people call this moral intuitionism, and the idea here is that we shouldn't have an absolute abstract moral theory, but we should kind of justify our existing kind of moral intuitions and follow these intuitions where they lead. But this, he worries, leads to a kind of anything goes, and we know that climate change in many ways is a result of business as usual and not focusing enough on the kind of costs of the status quo. So based on these, you might think that utilitarianism is the answer, and this is for Jamieson the theory that we are morally required to act in such a way that is to produce the best outcomes, because this moves from the kind of interiority of Kantianism. It's more expansive than contractualism, and it actually tells us that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, and pluralism. And so the emphasis on action and actual consequences seems super appealing. Now, there's lots of debate over precisely what this means in terms of the best outcomes. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of references in the Jamieson article to active utilitarianism and motive utilitarianism. I don't want you to get too buried in the weeds here. Don't get hung up on that. But let's kind of assume for the moment that it's true, that we should act in ways that make the world a better place as a kind of default moral assumption. Now, there's plenty of criticisms of utilitarianism, and Jamieson's not trying to kind of defend utilitarianism against these criticisms. He's trying to say, like, if we assume this idea that we should act in ways that make the world a better place, what is the right thing to do in the context of climate change? And so he begins his kind of theory with this idea on page 319 that we are cognitively and motivationally weak creatures with a shortage of time, facts, and benevolence. We're not going to be able to know everything. We have motivational incentives to not care about a lot of things. We have limited time, limited facts, and we are like psychologically not always well-meaning and altruistic. And so it's impossible for us to be perfect utilitarians, both because we can't know what is always going to be the right thing to do in every situation. We can't, but also because we don't always have the motivation to do so. So how should a utilitarian, how should someone who believes that we should act in ways to make the world a better place when responding to climate change, what should they do? And Jamieson draws 3 lessons. I'm going to kind of summarize the argument that Jamieson makes for cultivating virtues through these 3 lessons. The first is that we should avoid calculation. He calls this as the non-contingency idea, but he's saying that we shouldn't make our decisions based on trying to calculate what everyone else is trying to do. He writes on page 318 that when it comes to large-scale collective action problems, calculation invites madness or cynicism. Madness because the sums are impossible to do, or cynicism because it appears that both morality and self-interest demand that I get mine. Right, so we either can't calculate what the likely outcomes of everyone's actions are going to be, and so it's hard for us to know exactly how our actions will contribute to that. But it also invites cynicism in the sense that we've already seen in Jamieson's work earlier that, since my contribution to climate change is probably pretty marginal compared to the 7 billion other people on the planet, then what would make the world a better, since my action isn't going to make the world a better place or worse place in terms of climate change, maybe I should just enjoy my own life, because that will make the world a better place, because it's going to increase the amount of happiness that I experience, and the happiness that I experience is part of the whole. So Jamieson argues that instead of looking to moral mathematics for practical solutions to large-scale collective action problems, we should focus instead on the non-calculable generators of behavior, character traits, dispositions, emotions, and what I call virtues. So rather than looking to ground and motivate behavior by saying, like, look, if you do this, you will cause this much good in the world, or you will alleviate this much suffering in the world, this kind of Singer-esque calculation, he says that, like, look, we need to focus on acting in ways that we need to focus on cultivating the things that are going to actually make us act, our virtues, our traits, our dispositions, our emotions. And so instead of focusing on trying to figure out exactly what everyone else is doing, we should act in ways that are not dependent on others. We should just bracket the question of what anyone else is doing. So assume that no one else is going to take actions to fight climate change. We still think that we should if we're going to get people to act on climate change, we have to kind of bracket this and focus on what is going to motivate me as an individual, regardless of what other people are doing. And it's not calculating possible outcomes. It's cultivating these virtues. And then we can kind of expand this picture, right? If everyone started acting this way, if everyone started focusing on their own character and cultivating green virtues rather than passing the buck to someone else, then we would actually lead to better outcomes. The second lesson that Jamieson draws is this idea of flexibility or responsiveness. That virtues, he writes, gives utilitarians a way of making human behavior inflexible enough to deal with collective action problems, right? It binds us to doing the right thing and not looking for a way out by calculating the lack of the marginal effectiveness of my individual action. But outside of the context of collective action problems, it is flexible patterns of behavior that are generally needed for utility maximizing. That he uses the example of, like, should he give a ride to his friend Peter? He's referring to Peter Singer here as a joke, to his Oxfam meeting. He's like, well, if I'm being too inflexible, I will refuse to do that, even though Peter doesn't own a car and can't otherwise get to this Oxfam meeting, because I've decided that I have a strict rule about driving my car. But in this particular case, there might be other virtues that matter here. We might want to be more responsive to the specific circumstances, and that part of a green virtue might be, oh, maybe it is justified for me to drive Peter to this conference so that we can, you know, work to maximize the good overall, so that we can make the world a better place in this way. So here is the idea is that virtues have to be responsive to specific situations and challenges. We need a rigid enough moral compass to force us to do something, right? But we need to be responsive to the particular demands and situations so that we can exercise good practical reasoning, especially when we're dealing with potential exceptions and contingencies and qualifications to our moral arguments. The third lesson is what I call don't be a nihilist. And so he raises this objection on pages 322 to 333 of like, if it's too late to solve global warming, wouldn't the better option from a utility maximizing perspective be to everyone just have a sweet party and enjoy the decline, right? If we're all going extinct everyone's going to enjoy the decline of human civilization much more if we just have a sweet party and we go extinct in the next couple hundred years, rather than trying to squeak out a meager existence for like another 400 or 500 years. And Jamieson thinks that utilitarianism can lead to this type of conclusion, but a virtue ethics approach leads to a better way of thinking about the problem. Because he notes on page 324 that global environmental change is not like the case of impending interplanetary collision that is entirely beyond our control. It's not Posner-Sunstein's asteroid, for example, nor is it an all-or-nothing phenomenon. Collectively, we can prevent or mitigate various aspects of global environmental change. An individual agent can affect collective behavior in several ways. That it's not, climate change isn't a switch, right? If it's not that, well, if we don't make it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then human civilization ends, right? Nor is it the case that if we made it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that human civilization would be a utopia, right? There are degrees of badness, of suffering that are going to happen in the world. And a 2-degree world is better than a 3-degree world. A 3-degree world is better than a 3.5-degree world. A 3-degree world is better than a 4-degree world, and so on. And so even if we can't meet our ideals, a virtuous approach is going to say, like, well, this is still going to be the best thing to do. And it's going to acknowledge that this is not an all or nothing. It is not a choice between two kind of absolute ends, but the choice of what is going to be the best case scenario that we can achieve in this particular situation. So cultivating virtues allows us to kind of avoid this nihilism, avoid this passivity with respect to climate change. So towards the end of the article, he doesn't give us like a full list of all the virtues that we should cultivate, but instead he gives us 3 ways of thinking about virtues. The first is we can think of certain virtues that should be preserved, and here he's referring to existing virtues and existing values that we have as a society or as individuals that already promote sustainable behavior and that already motivate us to take action against climate change. And so these we should preserve, these we should maintain. And one of the examples that he gives here is the idea of humility. And this idea of humility should force us to be more respectful of nature and force us to be more cautious and more sustainable, because we recognize that we are not all powerful species. The second category of virtues are virtues that need to be rehabilitated. They need to be revised or refined to promote sustainable behavior. The main idea is there, but it needs to be tweaked in new context. And for this example, he gives moderation. And it's not just about kind of self-control or self-discipline in an abstract sense, or with respect to like bodily pleasures, which is how usually this virtue is discussed, right? Not having too much to drink or too much to eat or too much sex, or enjoying these things moderately in a self-controlled way. And here he's saying that this moderation can be adapted to an ecological context to encourage recycling, reusing, upcycling, trying to find ways in preserving, minimizing our use of natural resources and our destruction on the environment by acting moderately. Finally, are virtues that need to be created, and these are new values that he thinks we might need in the context of climate change. And one that he gives here is the idea of mindfulness. So rather than kind of our unthinking, our thoughtless kind of following routines in a kind of Jungian sense, that we need to cultivate a certain amount of attentiveness to what we're doing. Thinking more critically about where our food comes from and being mindful about the human and ecological labor that goes into our food production. We need to think more critically about how our ordinary behavior contributes to climate change, and maybe we start acting a little bit more mindfully. We organize all of our errands on one day so that we can be more efficient with driving our car. Maybe we don't take it. We find maybe we pay for offsets when we fly, or try to find vacations, or try to travel to vacations in ways that are more environmentally sustainable. Just being more mindful about what we're doing, Jamieson thinks, can help us live more sustainable lives. So, in his 2014 book, Reason in a Dark Time, Jamieson expands this idea to think about respect for nature as a particular virtue. And he writes in that book that nature provides the background against which we live our lives. It provides us with an important source of meaning. And importance of meaning is thus not surprising that we delight in nature and take joy in its operations, and we feel grief and nostalgia when familiar patterns are disrupted and natural features are destroyed. And here he means respect for nature, not as a kind of we need to fully submit ourselves to nature, right? A kind of misanthropic humanity is the disease, and we need to kind of get rid of humanity in order to give back a pristine, perfect nature. But he's saying that there's a healthy amount of appreciation for the value, the beauty, the interconnectedness of nature, and ourselves as part of nature, but not something fully subsumed into something kind of rejected by nature. This respect for nature can give us a sense of humility. It can encourage a sense of moderation and sustainability, and that we should kind of inculcate this respect and not view nature as either a commodity to be used, or an alien force that needs to be mastered, but ourselves as kind of interconnected and dependent upon nature. And that this will allow us to kind of rethink the way that we act in our daily lives if we're thinking about respecting nature in our daily decisions. So he also entertains a problem, and many of you might be thinking of this argument, but like, what about the state? What role does politics have in this account? This is a pretty apolitical account of virtue. And so he says, like, yeah, some people might say that what is needed is not virtuous citizens, but coercive state power. So Jamieson has a couple of responses. First, in the essay that you read, he says, I don't see these as mutually exclusive alternatives. Legitimate states can only arise and be sustained among people who act, reason, and respond in particular ways. That is, the state isn't going to act unless there are people, a virtuous citizenry that can compel the state to act. That you need, if you want to have state action, it's going to require virtuous people, and virtuous people is probably going to require some state action, right? He's not saying that we don't need the state, but that we need to kind of, it's a both and, not an either or. This gets us into a kind of chicken and egg problem, though, that many commentators have called the paradox of politics, which is, do we need good institutions to cultivate just citizens, or do we need just citizens to build virtuous, or do we need virtuous citizens to cultivate just institutions, right? Which comes first, institutions or citizen virtue? And no one really has a good answer to it. That's why it's a paradox. But I think this is kind of what Jamieson is getting at, that it has to be a both and approach. And in the book, he says, he introduces his discussion of virtues by saying that our failure to prevent or even respond significantly to climate change reflects the impoverishment of our systems of practical reason, and the limits of our the paralysis of our politics and the limits of our cognitive and affective capacity. So here, what he's saying is precisely because our politics have failed that we need to turn to virtues, and we need to cultivate these virtues. That we can't simply externalize our obligation and responsibility to the state, because they've already proven that our existing political institutions aren't up to snuff. So the only thing we kind of have left is acting virtuously instead of becoming reliant, and that there's a virtue in this kind of self-reliance rather than trying to point fingers to institutions that have failed us. Now, this, for many, might sound defeatist, but Jamieson kind of is taking this to be a realist approach, right? That, given the institutions that we have, and given their inequity, and given their lack of justice, this is kind of the only option. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do more, but this is what we actually can do. So next class, we're going to look at a slightly different approach to kind of green virtues. And this is an argument from Sherilyn McGregor on a kind of form of radical green feminist citizenship. So what does a green political ethic look like, and how would it differ from the virtue ethic that Jamieson suggests? Now, for your discussion threads, the first kind of question is, do you find this account of green virtue ethics persuasive? Do you find Jamieson's arguments about cultivating virtue persuasive? If so, further develop this argument by describing a virtue that you think must be preserved, rehabilitated, or created in order to respond to climate change in a just way. If you're not persuaded by Jamieson's argument, for a well-reasoned critique of his reasoning. Remember, you post your 200-word post to any of this week's threads by Friday at midnight, and you reply to a peer's post with 100 words by Sunday at midnight. Sorry. So that is it for today's lecture. Let me know if you have any questions. Happy to talk more about Jamieson, virtue ethics, and green and what this means in the context of climate change and office hours in the discussion section on Friday or over email. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. As always, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.